The content of this episode may not be suitable for some audiences. Listener's discretion is advised. Welcome to the place of rest, where our aim is to give you language that helps you displace the growing confusion, chaos, and dis-ease of our times. In today's episode, Virginia explores the limits of psychology, the anatomy of the soul, and calls for a profound reset in mental health. We hope you enjoy today's conversation. In February, we are focusing on the soul. We touched a little bit about that in the last episode. You were telling me about a conversation you had with some psychologists, and with psychology being the study of the soul. I was hoping you could have something that you could share from those conversations.
Thank you, Jonathan. As you well know, this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, primarily because I know that there are many well-intentioned therapists that got into the study of the soul for the sole purpose of helping people. They care. And I have an enormous amount of respect for people that endeavor to do hard things. It's impossible to work in a realm that is not well defined. And we talked last month a little bit about the spirit. What is our spirit? It can be understood in terms of energy, frequency, vibration, physics, metaphysics. But at the end of the day, our spirit is something that is measurable. It has mass. Invisible as it may seem, it does have a constitution. It has a being. In the spiritual realm, we're continuously being informed. What is being informed? Where does that information go? What navigates that information? It's the soul, the mind, the heart, the will, the conscience, the feelings of a person. And I just want to say that feelings emote. So feelings are the internal function of the soul, happy, sad, confused. And emotions are their expression. And a lot gets lost between the anatomy of the soul, the mind, the heart, the will, the feelings, right? The conscience, all that of our very constitution. And a lot gets lost in translation from the heart to the brain. So, for example, we always mention that behind anger and rage, that's not the emotion of rage or anger. That's generally not the feeling associated with that emotion. So at R.E.S.T, we spend an enormous amount of time distinguishing between the internal function of a thing and the external cause. Fundamentally, the internal function is liberty. How do we process that conversation of the soul between our mind, our heart, our will, our conscience, and our feelings? How do we process that? That is the measure of liberty we live with. Depending on how we negotiate it, that conversation determines the measure of freedom we live with, how we show up for life, right? Because the things that really enslave us are an internal function of a conversation we're having within ourselves, among ourselves, our spirit, our soul, and our body, and the secrets and the things we do not want to disclose. So a lot of what happens in the soul is one of my favorite conversations, because we have a lot of biometrics, technologies, and resources and tools to really distinguish that conversation. I went to church on Sunday and they were talking about Galatians chapter 5, right? So you think about church. Okay, church, existential. Church, spiritual. Church, Christianity. I'm a Buddhist. I believe in Islam. I believe in X, Y, and Z, right? So you can't talk about these parts of our Constitution independent of the other. So here I am at church and I'm listening to a teaching on Galatians. And I thought immediately, wow, he's talking about the science of rest. in the conversation of the spiritual realm. I almost called you, actually. I was so excited when I left. And because one of my mentors, my longtime mentors, Catherine Dane, that has taught me a lot about government, lawful, unlawful, about kingdoms and authorities and all of that history and government and education. She said to me a few years ago that rest is science because it can be proven. Rest, as you define it, relational, emotional, and spiritual truth, is essential to sustain a person's life. And Virginia, somehow, by the grace of God, you have developed or brought resources together to do what? To help people understand that. And with TKM, one of our greatest resources that we have. Why is all this important? Because you and I and the team at R.E.S.T is always trying to connect the disconnections between the spirit, the soul, and the body of the people we serve so they can go into spontaneous remission, so they can heal from the nervous breakdown, so they can heal from the concussion, if you will, so they can heal from the violent rape or, the horrific things that we hear spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, and physically, right? So this conversation kind of becomes important. So the soul has all those parts I just defined, but I don't want you to get caught up into these aspects of psychology, omitting what we talked about for a month, which is the spiritual constitution that beckons our soul. So the spirit always brings information in the form of just, unjust, lawful, unlawful, right and wrong, truth or false, right? Good energy, bad energy, sadly, sometimes in the form of the demonic and in the form of angels and in the form of good and evil. And the beautiful thing about this 6 million document dump, the beautiful part of it is there's no longer any question of the reality of evil and the importance of goodness. We got to choose which side we're going to stand on that equation. But before we choose what side we're going to stand with, we need to realize, what am I doing in the quiet chambers of my own heart with the things I'm consuming, the stuff I'm buying, the things I'm watching, the things I'm talking about? How do I show up for life? How do I show up for my husband? How do I show up for my children? So before we start talking about everything that's wrong with everybody else, we got to take a step back and say, wait, what's happening in my own soul? Before I accuse the mental illness, or before I cast judgment on the mental illness or mental state or mental condition or the psychology, the soul of another person, I better hit a hard pause and say, what's happening in my soul? Where am I compromised? Where has there been a breach in communication between my own conscience and the things I ought to do and the things I do? What is happening with the way I treat my husband, with the way I treat my children, with the frustration I feel with Virginia? Because what the heck, why can't she get on to record a podcast for 30 minutes? No, really, frustration. And I know she tried and she showed up a few times, but at the end of the day, what a flake. She couldn't even get a thought out. This is so frustrating. I got to keep on this schedule. Okay, Jonathan, you're right? And I mean, I don't know that this happened. I'm just giving a stupid example directly related to us. But those are times where we have to take a hard pause and say, wait a minute, what am I talking about? Obviously, Virginia's brain's being afflicted. She's not well. Her lungs aren't working. She's got a pneumonia, for God's sake. And she can't get oxygen to her body, to her brain. She's not well. So I'm just saying that's a stupid example that I'm giving. But when we talk about the soul, our psychology, and the psychology of others, I want to invite everybody listening to take a hard pause and say, wait a minute, what am I doing? Why am I saying that? How then shall I live when in X, Y, and Z, I've been conflicted myself and I took the path of least resistance. And if I'm truthful, I did what served me, not another. Does that make sense, Jonathan?
Virginia, as you are speaking, a lot of things come to mind because you're bringing up a lot, things that we've discussed about the spirit, things that we discussed last episode about the soul.
Well, the therapist that you began with, and I thought, Jonathan, I got to talk about this situation for a minute, is one of many that I've spoken to in the course of the last 3 years. And not just therapists, but functional neurologists that we've interviewed that literally said, I'm trying to build my business and frankly, this isn't going to be a good discussion. It's not going to help me build my business. Okay. Why? Because we're so practical about giving people tools so they can facilitate their own healing, or they can come see us a few times and we can give them enough resources to facilitate healing. They don't have to be enslaved to a system, right? To a functional neurologist, a functional psychiatrist, a functional therapist. You don't have to be enslaved to anything or anybody if you learn how to live in the rhythms of rest. So
I think that is so key right there, is that we don't realize that we don't have to be enslaved to these things.
no, or to people or institutions or things. And I think that's why we're praying that in the course of this next year, in the course of the next few years, that this message of rest can go national, because we can heal the hemorrhaging heart of our nation in one generation. But we've got to start having the right conversation around our very constitution, our spirit, our soul, and our body. But since we're talking about our soul today, and the reflecting on the conversations and the interviews I've done with therapists, I want to say how much compassion I have for therapists and the confinements and the limitations that they need to operate within. And I think I feel such a tender place in my heart specifically about the therapists that I've spoken to in the last 6-9 months. And more recently, they all have the same story. And it's, wow, where did you learn this stuff? How can I do it? I could never say what you just said because I'm licensed. You're an educator, Virginia. I'm licensed. Now we have licensed people here in-house, of course, and we're in compliance with the state. But I'm trying to help people understand the rhythms of rest so they can facilitate their lives in a productive way that doesn't enslave them financially, psychologically, and even the physical confinement sometimes that there are to getting to a therapist. But I think the conversation with the therapist, it was just a seed of an idea that the guy was beaming with joy because he said, I feel you're a lifeline to me because I can't say the things you say. I can't use the modalities you're using, and I can't do what you're doing. So I want to thank you so much. And I was able to say to this therapist, not in competition, not in agreement, not in pride, I was able to say in love, please let me help you help them. I said, in our team, we're going to have a Heal the Healer Day. That Dr. Cowden set the tone for that. And I hosted that at Center for New Medicine by consent and agreement and collaboration with Dr. Lee Aaron Keneally, which was wonderful. And we had a Heal the Healer Day. And it was strictly for our entire team. And so this year, I'm going to pick this therapist. I'm going to invite him personally and a handful of others. Hopefully we can keep it down to 10 or 15. And we're going to have a Heal the Healer Day so we can bless them with the message of rest, with the language of rest, with the rhythms of rest, with the matrix of rest, and give them hope that when they're stuck, they can personally come here and we can do things that they're not going to find somewhere else, but they can also send some difficult, compromised clients that they've been seeing for 8 and 10 years. Can you imagine the flipping insanity of having to see the same therapist for 8 to 10 years? Something's wrong. That shouldn't be the role of a therapist in the life of a client. It should be freedom. And there's no freedom in developing an intimate relationship, working relationship with your therapist that goes on 8 to 10 to 12 years. It just shouldn't be happening. The goal is to get your parts, your spirit, your soul, your body in alignment, communicating with one another so that you can be free. And that transaction happens in the mystery that we call the soul, in the field we call psychology, and the thing that's become a trade and an industry, which is called mental health. Well, the mind is a function of the soul, your mind, your heart, your will, your conscience, your feelings. And the profession should be all of our responsibility, which is to have stewardship over the conversation that's happening in our individual souls. Now, there are excellent people, but perhaps we don't need all the therapy that we're having. Well, not perhaps, we certainly do not. That's why mental illness has become what it is. How can mental illness have plummeted? How is it that our mental state has disintegrated to the place that it has. And we have more therapists, more drugs, more psychiatrists, more mental health institutions growing, and they want to reinstitution. Are you flipping kidding me? They've had control of our mind, if you will, for 40 flipping years. A field, an industry, a trade, a field of study. No, it doesn't work. That's not what the answer is. So when I meet honest therapists and doctors and clinicians and psychiatrists and functional doctors that have open hearts and open minds to have open dialogue about the mess that we're in, and when we can say, wow, this is fantastic, Virginia, let's collaborate. We can turn this thing around together. This isn't about disparaging an entire field and an entire industry. But what I am saying is we need a hard reset. And it's not going to come when we're lining the pockets of big pharma, clinicians, institutions, and therapists. That's not how it's going to come. It's going to come when we as clinicians, therapists, scientists come together and say, hey, we're missing something. It's not enough. It's going to take us being willing to show up with integrity, looking at the limitations within ourselves, in spite of how the field may be serving us, for the good of what's happening nationally. And if we're not willing to deal with the spiritual realities, which we discussed last month, of good and evil, right and wrong, Satanism and Christianity, come on, let's call it what it is. Or religions that expand life and religions that diminish life. You all know what those are. If we're not willing to show up with measures of integrity for those conversations, we're going to be sunk. And I want to put that in the positive. We can show up to those conversations. We can show up with integrity. We can show up with life. We can show up without compromise. And we can engage each other without disparaging each other. Because when this disparaging starts, then you know what your psychological state is in. It's falling apart. You got to be able to show up with integrity, even if you're in strong disagreement with the satanic cult. It's very simple. The satanic cult is one that systematically will bring about destruction. The father of lies, the author of confusion, he comes to kill, steal, and destroy. Why? Because he requires sacrifices, and the sacrifices are blood sacrifices. And those blood sacrifices are for what? I'd like to read this to you. The desires of our conflicted self, our conflicted nature. And we measure that here every flipping single day. We can tell you exactly what your conflicted nature and your conflicted thoughts are. And it's the battle between your psychology, your soul, and your very anatomy that's carrying the stories and narratives of generations. And we're going to talk about that next month. The results are very clear. Sexual immorality, impurity, lustful pleasures, idolatry, sorcery. That means we get into the occult. And again, we have 6 million beautiful pages of videos, testimony, everything that exposes what? The truth. That's why I say they're beautiful. They expose the truth. Now, I don't recommend anybody do what I did and delve into the truth of what's behind those 6 million. As a matter of fact, I encourage you not to. It'll begin to slowly speak to the lowest common denominator that's within your very nature, that's depraved, that you struggle with every day. And it's going to make you fearful, and it's going to make you literally think you're going batshit crazy. How does humanity do this to people, to infants, to children? So I don't recommend it. But here it all is, right there. Sexual immorality, impurity, lustful pleasures, idolatry, sorcery, there it is. Witchcraft, the demonic, the sacrifice of babies, hostility, quarreling, jealousy, outbursts of anger, selfish ambition, dissension, division, envy, drunkenness, wild parties, and other things that prove the conflict that lies within the anatomy of the human condition. Let me tell you again, as I have before, that anyone living that sort of life will not be able to access the power and the authority that the psychology, the mind, the heart, the will, the conscience of a person has access to in this side of life. But that means aligning with God. Because there are kingdoms in conflict. We're seeing it all over Washington, D.C. We're seeing it all over the world. We saw it with COVID. The gig's up, the lie's up. We see the organization and the structuring of government systems against what? Against humanity. For what? Dominion and control. Well, let me ask you something. What's going to be left standing if this kind of psychological compromise in our private lives, forget Epstein, forget the government, forget all the corruption on both sides of the aisle, by the way. I want to invite everybody before we hang up today, before we close today, do business with the corruption within yourself. Evil cannot prosper in your life. Mental illness cannot advance. If you stop lying to yourself, judging everybody else, hating on everybody else, criticizing everybody else, if you can do business with your own conscience and deal with the conflicts within yourself, that is true healing. Nobody knows more about you than you do. Pull out the splinters in your soul, deal with the secrets, expose everything that's vile with somebody you trust, and get the help you need to live in the rhythms of rest. We can turn what's happening in this nation around in one generation. And in my sickened state and in my illness, it became very clear to me that something really bizarre was happening here in the office. We're onto something together, but the invitation is to our listening audience to rally with us. Don't grow weary. We've done what we can with what we've had, but our commitment is to take this conversation nationally, internationally. And that's already happening. So thank you for your patience with me. Thank you for your kindness. Thank you.
We hope listening to this episode has brought you closer to experiencing the freedom of wholeness and healing. If you have questions or comments about today's episode, or for updates about REST, please visit our Instagram or Facebook at The Place of Rest. If you would like more information about Virginia, or to support and join the cause of rest, please go to theplaceofrest.com/donate or call 949-289-5935. Thank you for listening to Rest with Virginia Dixon. We'll see you next week.